After causing a string of typhoid outbreaks, Mary Mallon was forced into a permanent quarantine. But decades after her death, historians now believe almost everything we knew about her is completely wrong. Everywhere Mary Mallon went, death followed. Working as a cook in a wealthy household, and suddenly, sickness. Moving on to another house, in the blink of an eye, entire families down for the count. All the while, Mary was in perfect health. For decades, no one understood what was happening, and when they finally discovered the truth, the real nightmare began. At first, Mary found work as a maid, but in 1900, she landed on what would be the most lucrative occupation she'd ever have: a private cook for families throughout New York. And as her experience with cooking for families grew, wealthier and wealthier clans began to hire her. Even then, a disturbing pattern was emerging. From 1900 to 1907, she jumped around quite a bit between families, working first in Mamaroneck, New York, but relocating soon after in 1901 to Manhattan. By the summer of 1904, Mary was working in yet another household, this time with the well-to-do lawyer Henry Gilsey, but she didn't stay long there either. Each time, usually just before she left a family, one alarming event occurred. Wherever Mary Mallon went, sickness came too. Almost every family she stayed with showed signs of typhoid fever, an illness that ravages its victims, burning them up with fever for weeks, wasting away and weakening their bodies, and sometimes even killing them. And while no one yet knew what was happening, the trail Mary left told a tale. When she worked in Mamaroneck, the residents developed typhoid fever within just 2 weeks of her arrival. When she went to Manhattan, the family members also developed fevers and diarrhea, both symptoms of the fever. The late 19th century had no real way to understand why these outbreaks were occurring, but evidence just kept piling up. Having shown no symptoms of typhoid fever herself, Mary must have thought that she was cursed, and in a way, she was. By 1906, she had made it all the way to Oyster Bay on Long Island, where she was working again as a cook for the New York banker Charles Eliot Warren at the family's leased summer home. History repeated once more. 6 people in the family contracted typhoid fever, and once more the outbreak was an extremely rare occurrence in that location. This time, though, it didn't just all go away. The landlord of the summer home hired several experts to track down where the fever had come from. One of the investigators was sanitary engineer George Soper, who couldn't seem to let the mystery go. Soper had heard of more typhoid outbreaks among several affluent families in the New York City area, and he was sure it couldn't have been a coincidence. As he looked further into the outbreaks, he noticed that one figure kept popping up, that of a heavy-set female Irish-born cook who was eminently healthy despite these outbreaks. Yet every time he tried to locate her, he discovered that this cook had left immediately after the outbreak, without giving anyone a forwarding address to reach her at. The circumstances set off alarm bells, but it was nothing compared to the horror that came next. In March of 1907, Soper finally tracked the 37-year-old Mary Mallon down to the Park Avenue brownstone where she was currently working, finding her in the kitchen. He told her he believed that she was somehow the cause of all these awful outbreaks, and he wanted to take samples of her blood and other fluids. But Mary's reply made his blood run cold. She reacted with a fury from almost the moment that the words escaped his lips. As he recalled, she seized a carving fork and advanced in my direction. but Soper still refused to let the issue go. After leaving Mary that day, he went through his meticulous notes and compiled everything he knew about the families Mary had worked for during her career as a cook. The evidence was damning. All in all, a full 7 of the total 8 families she worked for were blighted by typhoid fever in one way or another. Mary Mallon was one of the very first known carriers of a disease. That is, she was someone who was asymptomatic of an illness, in her case, typhoid fever, but she nonetheless did carry the illness with her and could infect other people with it. Soper knew he was right, and that Mary was a danger to others, if not to herself. He then notified the New York City Health Department of his findings, and they took desperate measures. Feeling they were out of options, the city descended on Mary, but she did not go gently. When the officers came to arrest her as a public health threat, she managed to evade them for 5 whole hours, hiding out. A scrap of her dress, which had gotten caught in the door to where she was hiding, eventually gave her away, and still she fought with them. Mary was outraged at the accusations, and 5 officers had to force her into an ambulance, while a doctor reportedly had to sit on her to restrain her while they brought her in. Even so, Mary's nightmare was only just beginning. The Irish cook ended up at Willard Parker Hospital, where authorities continued to treat her as a hostile enemy. There, they forcibly restrained and equally forcibly took samples from her at long last. Investigators questioned her on various aspects of her hygiene, and most shockingly discovered that she almost never washed her hands. In March of 1907, the government sent her from the hospital to full quarantine on North Brother Island, and still she kept fighting. Mary solicited the help of a friend and sent some of her samples to an independent laboratory. The results were eye-opening. All of these samples came back negative for typhoid. Regardless of the results, the city decided to keep her in quarantine for 3 full years. Eventually, the New York State Commissioner decided that she could once more go out into society, provided that she avoided transmitting her disease to other people, specifically by giving up her work as a cook. Desperate to leave, she signed an affidavit swearing that she would find other employment and return to mainland New York. But this was far from the end of her story, or her tragedy. The thing is, Mary Mallon lived an extremely precarious life. She owned no home of her own and was always on the verge of destitution if just one thing went wrong. Now that her reputation was destroyed and she was facing a life of extreme poverty, she had no choice but to get herself employment as a laundry worker, even though it paid less than half the salary of her cooking work. She nonetheless stuck it out until she couldn't anymore. During this job, she injured her arm and the wound got infected, which put her out of any work at all for half a year. It was all too much for her to take. After trying for years to avoid cooking work, Mary finally broke down and started the more lucrative job once more. More desperate than ever, she worked under fake last names, ones like Breshoff or Brown, and accepted employment as a cook anywhere that she could, even though the higher-end families were now out of her reach. Mary still didn't believe in her diagnosis, and she might have thought that she would get away with it, but she was wrong. For the next little while, she toiled mostly in kitchens of restaurants, hotels, and spas. It was a case of terrible deja vu. Nearly everywhere that Mary went, a typhoid outbreak was sure to follow. In fact, George Soper, who continued to track the outbreaks, saw them and immediately knew that Mary Mallon was cooking once again, but he could never manage to get her before she left the job. Even so, her final reckoning was around the corner, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In 1915, Mary took up work at the Sloan Hospital for Women. It was one of her deadliest jobs. Before long, 25 people in the vulnerable establishment were infected, with 2 of them dying. Alarmed and concerned for the patients, the chief obstetrician called up none other than George Soper and asked him to intervene. Soper knew exactly what and who he was dealing with. After very little time talking to hospital staff, he had confirmed Mary's presence in the hospital. People started giving verbal descriptions of her, and Soper also found her handwriting on site. Her ghostly traces and her illness were everywhere, but Mary Mallon herself had already fled. She just couldn't run forever. In the wake of the hospital outbreak, a full-blown manhunt commenced for Mary. Eventually, officers were tipped off to her whereabouts after she took food to a friend on Long Island, and they immediately found and arrested her. Once more, they sent her off in shackles to North Brother Island for quarantine on March 27, 1915. This time, there was no way out. Mary Mallon never got out of this second quarantine, and would stay on North Brother Island for over 23 years in a private cottage until her death in 1932 at the age of 69. Around the time of her first quarantine, the press dubbed Mary Typhoid Mary, the name she is still infamous for today. But Mary hated the term, and speaking of bacteriologist Dr. William Park, wrote to her lawyer saying, "I wonder how the said Dr. William H. Park would like to be insulted and put in the journal and call him or his wife Typhoid William Park." But decades after Mary's death, historians now believe almost everything we knew about her is completely wrong. They cite her case as a lesson in medical ethics, public health, and how to treat the ill, pointing out that New York health officials had identified some 400 other healthy carriers of typhoid, but that she was the only one who was punished. Some came to the conclusion that this case highlighted the problematic nature of the subject and the need for an enhanced medical and legal social treatment model aimed at improving the status of disease carriers and limiting their impact on society. In fact, Mary Mallon actually taught doctors how to identify asymptomatic carriers of not just typhoid, but other diseases too, and she was punished for it. As it happens, it's not extremely rare to be a carrier of typhoid fever. Up to 6% of people who've had typhoid become carriers themselves, and there were hundreds of carriers in New York during Mary's time. If we think about it countrywide, there were thousands of carriers in the United States. Yet, for all that, Mary was the only one forcibly quarantined. To this day, Mary Mallon's story is a pressure point for ethics and public health, with many experts, even during Mary's time, believing her forced quarantines were unnecessary and unnecessarily damaging. Although we may never know exactly how or when she contracted typhoid, there's real possibility that it was always with her. One theory suggests that her mother, who contracted typhoid while she was pregnant with Mary, passed it on to her baby, and therefore Mary came into the world with the destructive potential inside of her. Still, it doesn't mean that she deserved her fate. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.